Hello everyone and welcome to Quality Old Games. Today we are making a tier list of factions in Rome Total War. And we are going through them in alphabetical order, and this is the overall rating of all the factions, including also the non-playable ones, namely the Rebels and the Senate. I know there is some tweaks you can make so that you can play them, but this is the overall tier list of the factions. And let's begin with Armenia. They begin in the Asia Minor. They are surrounded by the Scythians, Parthians and Pontus, maybe the Seleucids as well. Their unit roster is not so great. Some horse archers, cataphracts, they are okay, but they are the high tier units in the early game. Their roster is pretty poor, so I'm going to place them in, let's say, in B tier. Then we have Britons. Their starting location in the northwestern part of the map is pretty well defended. They initially have to contend only with the Gauls and Germanians, so that gives them a lot of points. In the unit roster wise, the chariots are pretty okay, but they are lacking in infantry, even though head hurlers are pretty decent. And their starting cities, and actually the cities which they can initially conquer are pretty poor. So I think because of that they will go to C tier, even though the chariots are pretty good. But since Armenia has some rich cities nearby and they have horse archers, they have a better ranking here. Then we have the first Roman faction, namely the Brutii, and their starting position is in Italy. Other Roman factions, namely the Julii, Scipii and the SPQR, the Roman Senate, guards their back and flanks pretty well, and they are positioned next to Greece, and the cities in Greece are very wealthy, so the starting position is pretty decent. As every Roman faction, the unit roster here is very good, and it's kind of very multifaceted. There are lots of archer missile units, including Archer Auxilia, which is very decent archery unit. Then there are cavalry, especially after a Marian reform, very heavy cavalry, and the infantry ranges from light infantry to the heavy legionaries or Praetorian or urban cohorts. Additionally, the temples for Brutii boost the troops with initial experience, which is really nice. So I think the Brutii will go to S tier because of the quality of the troop roster as well as their good starting location. They can get dirty rich very fast, and the richest cities are their initial avenue of conquest. So let's move on to Carthage. Carthage starts in northern Africa and also in Spain and in some islands in the middle of Mediterranean, and also in Sicily, where they need to contest with Greek cities and Scipii. Some of the cities of Carthage, especially the Carthage itself, is very wealthy and grows quickly, so they can access high tier units pretty fast, which is nice. But the initial starting position, as it is so spread out, makes it difficult to protect the whole borders and concentrate the strength in one area. Carthage need to compete initially with at least Spain, maybe Gauls, as they are in Spain. They need to compete with likely Julii, who will try to take Sardinia, they need to contend with Greek cities, Scipii, Numidia, and soon enough with Egypt, so they are kind of surrounded by enemies. The troop roster for Carthage is pretty good. The initial troops of Iberian infantry are pretty much trash, but the higher quality troops up to Sacred Band, Libyan Spearmen, and so on are quite decent. They can form phalanx, which is always nice, especially against the AI. And they can build pretty good ships initially, so the troop roster and the accessibility of the troops is pretty decent early on. So even though the starting position is pretty difficult, I will put the Carthage to A tier, because it is possible to abandon some of the settlements you don't want to defend and then concentrate the troops, for example, to taking control of Northern Africa first and then moving forward. It's possible, and the troops are pretty good, especially since Carthage has war elephants in their unit roster. Then we have Dacia, another barbarian tribe, and they start in inland cities surrounded by Germania, Thracia, maybe even Scythia, as well as pretty soon they will encounter the Julii. So not as many enemies as with Carthage, but still quite a few, and the unit roster is kind of normal barbarian unit roster. They have the Foxmen, which are pretty good against legionary armor, but since they don't have shields, they are kind of vulnerable to missile fire. So I will put Dacians to C tier as well. If they manage to engage successfully Thracia, they can get some pretty decent cities, pretty rich cities, but I think the Thracians will at least initially have the upper hand in the battle, especially because of those cities. So they can field better armies to hold the Dacians off. So Dacia will have to contend itself with pretty poor cities and pretty low tier cities, at least in the early game. Then we have a very good faction, Egypt. Its starting position in where the modern Egypt is pretty decent. On the western side, it needs to contend with Numidia and Carthage at some point, and in the eastern flank, it needs to contend with Seleucids and at some point Parthia. They are the initial enemies. But Egypt is really far away from Roman factions, which will give it well enough time to grow. And it is in the richer part of the map. The Egyptian cities are pretty rich, and it has access to the Jerusalem, Sidon, Antioch, and those rich cities in the eastern part of Mediterranean. So the starting location is pretty good. Not maybe as good as with the House of Brutii, but really good still. And the unit roster of Egypt is also pretty decent. They have low quality hoplite troops to begin with, or phalanx troops to begin with, and also slingers and archers, so they have long range skirmishers available early on, and then in the late game they can have the Pharaoh's bowmen and Pharaoh's guard, or those well armored pikemen or spearmen that can form phalanx, which are really nice. So I think the Egypt deserves at least a high A tier, or maybe even a low S tier, but let's give them the A tier now. They are at least better than Carthage there. Then we have Gauls. Gauls suffer from the same weaknesses as other barbarian factions. Their unit roster is somewhat moderate. Of course, chosen swordsmen, barbarian noble cavalry are pretty decent, but they practically do not match well against legionaries with which Gauls need to contend with. As their starting position is pretty spread out, they will encounter the Julii, Spain, Germania, Britons, maybe Carthage early on, and all of these factions can field pretty decent units. Of course, the Gaulish warbands, if they have numerical superiority enough, will do quite decently against early game units, but pretty soon their morale will get too weak to stand their ground and so on. And also it's difficult to concentrate the troops of Gaul as they need to contend with possibly many enemies. And their cities, Alesia is pretty decent one, as well as Batavium and Mediolanum. All of these three cities will grow pretty fast, so they can access the unit roster pretty well. But as the Julii are right next to Batavium and Mediolanum, the Gauls will likely lose them pretty early on. But of these barbarian factions, I think Gauls will go to C tier, and I think they are better equipped than Dacians, but not as well as Britons, because the Britain's starting position is so much better than the Gauls one. Then we have another barbarian tribe, Germania, and they most definitely have very poor cities in their starting location and small cities. So it will take time or conquering larger cities to gain control of unit producing facilities that can make the high tier units. So that's definitely a minus for them. They are surrounded by Gauls, Dacians and Scythians, and they will encounter the Britons pretty soon as well. The unit roster of Germanians is a bit more diverse than the other barbarian factions, as their spearmen can make a phalanx, and then they have the berserkers, with which they can deal quite heavy damage in the battles. Of course, they are lacking decent archery units, and the cavalry isn't that good. But of the barbarian factions, I think Germania will beat the Gauls, maybe even the Britons, but because of the poor starting cities, they will earn only C tier. Then we have another of the kind of high culture factions, namely the Greek cities. And their strengths and weaknesses are pretty much comparable to that of Carthage. Their starting position is pretty spread out in Sicily, in southern Greece, in Rhodes, in Asia Minor, and so on. So it's difficult for them to concentrate the strength of their faction early on. But their units most certainly have strength, namely the armored hoplites, and hoplites are one of the, especially the armored hoplites are one of the best infantry units in the battle, especially if you can use them defensively or try to choke the enemies when they are assaulting a city. They are very good. And then Greek cities have pretty decent archery units, even though the actual archers are a bit of lacking, but they can recruit Grecian mercenaries pretty decently, so that can at least somewhat mitigate the weakness there. Unfortunately, their cavalry troops are rather weak, so their unit roster isn't, especially concerning the cavalry, as good as with Carthage. Then again, their starting position is a bit richer than that of the Carthage, but then they have many enemies around. All of the Roman factions, at least the Brutii and Julii, most likely too, and the Scipii as well. At least the Brutii and Scipii will engage the Greek cities early on. Then they have Macedon north of them, and in the Asia Minor there is Seleucids and Pontus at least, with which they need to contest with. So they have very strong enemies around. And because of that, even if they have the best infantry in the game, they will only earn high B tier. They might go to the A tier as well. Low A tier, high B tier, it's somewhere in the middle ground there. But because of the difficult factions they need to wage war early on, they will be placed in the B tier. Then we have another Roman faction, namely the House of Julii. The unit roster is similar to that of the House of Brutii, actually one of the most diverse in the game, and the infantry is one of the best in the game, and the cavalry and missile units are not lacking either, especially after Marian reforms. The Julii need to contest first with the Gauls, and in the northern Italy the Gauls have pretty decent armies, but as Gauls are likely to get into multiple wars early on, they cannot concentrate their strength against House of Julii. So eventually the Julii will gain upper hand in northern Italy. The cities or starting cities in northern Italy are not that good, and even the conquests that the Julii can make in the southwestern Europe initially are not that great. So it will be a bit of a poorer faction compared at least to the Brutii. But since other Roman factions are in southern Italy and overall in Italy, the House of Julii's flanks are pretty well secured eventually, or initially. The good thing about the northwestern Europe is that the other Roman factions are unlikely to gain foothold there, at least initially. So the House of Julii will be able to get pretty large land masses for itself if it can manage to conquer them. So that will give them a pretty good position in the Roman civil war. I think because this is a Roman faction with such a good unit roster, it deserves an S tier, but it's not as good as the House of Brutii. When the House of Julii will contact the Egyptians, I think they are pretty far enough developed to engage them in pretty good fights. So they will be able to march forward in the northern Europe and conquer these barbarian tribes. Maybe they can even take a city or two from Carthaginians. Then we have Macedon. Macedon is pretty much comparable to the Greek cities. Their starting location is in Greece and in Macedon, and the cities there are pretty rich, so Macedon will be able to field quite large armies, and the army quality will be decent enough. There will be quite good phalanx units as well as heavy cavalry that they can utilize, and also the missile units are decent enough for Macedon. The problem with their starting location is that they have quite powerful enemies surrounding them. In the south, there are Greek cities, and in the west, there are especially the House of Brutii of the Romans. And in the north, there are Thracians, which on the other hand won't pose that great a threat to the Macedonians. Another difficulty for the Macedonians is that there is a timed event, namely plague in Macedonia, which will hit their capital city, and that will wreak havoc in their economy and unit producing capabilities, and that will make them suffer quite badly, especially as they will get into war initially, at least with Greek cities and House of Brutii, both of which are quite powerful factions. So because of these limitations, I will give the Macedon a B tier. Without the plague, I think it could have reached the A tier, but the plague will hit them that hard that they will be placed in B tier. Then we have possibly the worst faction in the whole game, namely the Numidia. And their starting position in northern Africa is pretty well secured. They have no threats from south or west, but they need to contest with Carthage, which has highly superior unit roster compared to them. Numidia's starting cities are mostly pure. There may be one pretty decent city, but that won't be enough to offset the poor quality of other cities. So the starting position of Numidia is pretty bad. If they want to push forward, they need to beat Carthage, or they need to beat Spain, or they need to beat Egypt, and all of these are superior to them. And eventually, or rather pretty soon, there will likely be some Romans around as well, and Numidia just cannot compete with any of these factions with their unit roster. Of course, the skirmisher cavalry, Numidian cavalry, is pretty decent, but it won't make up for the lack of other troops Numidia has, or rather hasn't. So Numidia most definitely will go to D tier. Actually, I think I should have an empty D tier here and put Numidia into E tier. Then we have Parthia. Parthia starts in the eastern part of the map, and the initial cities are pretty poor. They have possibility to conquer decent cities, rather rich cities, from Seleucids and from Armenia. Their initial enemies are the Scythians as well as Seleucids and Armenia. The Parthian starting position is pretty spread out along the most of the eastern part of the map. So that's a big minus for them. Then the unit roster heavily concentrates on cavalry. Especially the missile cavalry. They have cavalry archers, are very good units, and with them they will be able to push against many many factions, especially if a human is playing Parthia. But as computer plays them, most often Parthia is left behind. Egypt is taking control of their areas and they need to contest with Scythians, which also have pretty decent missile cavalry units. Against Seleucid hoplites and war elephants, the Parthians can do pretty well, but since Seleucids will be taken out pretty soon, they cannot hope to compete with them. Then again, they can try to take on Armenia, which has also some decent cavalry units and a bit better infantry as well. But I think the Parthian cavalry capabilities make them at least better than Numidia, but not to the level of Macedon or Greek cities. So I think Parthia will gain a C tier here, a high C tier. So because they will contest with Armenia and they will be able to challenge those. Then we have another Middle Eastern faction, namely Pontus, starting in Asia Minor. They have pretty decent starting cities, but the first conquests for them are pretty poor cities. They can then, if they manage to beat Seleucids or Armenia or successfully wage war against Greek cities, especially conquest Pergamum, they have possibilities to capture pretty decent cities. And that's kind of neutral about their finances, how much gold they will get initially or in the early game. And if we consider their army, they kind of are a Middle Eastern faction. They don't have phalanxes, but they have some pretty decent missile cavalry. Their infantry is somewhat better than that of Armenia, at least initially. But their cavalry cannot match that of Parthia. At least, no, it cannot match that. And Pontus is surrounded by Seleucids, at least initially, and Armenia. So since Seleucids will have to fight in many fronts, they cannot concentrate on Pontus, and Armenia most likely will be pressed by Parthians as well. So that makes Pontus starting position pretty decent, but in the longer term they cannot compete, for example, with Roman factions or Egyptians, or even against Greek cities if the Greek cities get their armored hoplite production running. So I think Pontus will get a B tier. They will be most likely be able to beat Armenia, so that's put them before Armenia, as well as the a bit richer starting position. Then we have a non-playable faction, rebels here, and their troops vary quite largely, and they get their armies all around the map, and they are kind of the easy cities to conquest to expand the factions in the early game. Of course, if a city rebels, they can get pretty decent defenses or garrison there, but eventually the rebels are pretty much trash that are mobbed around by the kind of real factions. Of course, the initial starting capabilities or starting number of the cities for rebels are very strong, or the number of cities is very high, but they are lightly defended. They have poor garrisons, and they don't train more troops, so they will be overwhelmed at some point at least. Then we have third Roman faction, namely the House of Scipii. Unit roster here is once again very well rounded, with superior infantry and decent missile troops and cavalry, especially after Marian reforms. And the specialty of House of Scipii is that they can get the best naval units in the game altogether. They desires the biggest ships in the game, and Corvus triremes or whatever they were. They are very good naval units. And also their specialty temple that for Vulcan gives +3 to weapons if there is the foundry in the same city, so that will also be beneficial for them. Unfortunately for them, their starting position isn't that good, because as the Brutii will head towards Greece and the Julii towards the Middle and Northern Europe, the Scipii mostly has to fight against Carthage and try to take northern Africa. And the number of cities available for Scipii in most games is very limited. They will have to contend with less than 10 cities, as the Brutii and Julii push for much higher number. So when the civil war starts, the Scipii will be in pretty poor position to contend for Rome. So because of that, I will give them A tier. Most definitely they are able to beat Carthage, and if Egypt hasn't exploded, they will need to, or they can beat Egypt as well. And for Scipii, their flanks are secured by Brutii, Julii, and the Senate, and the starting position and their early conquests are pretty rich, even though those early conquests must be made against Greek cities and Carthage, which will make them quite a bit harder when compared to the early fights of Brutii and Julii. So that's the A tier for Scipii because of that. Then we have one of the nomadic factions, Scythians. They are mostly, or kind of a hybrid of Parthians and Dacians, kind of a barbaric nomadic faction. They have pretty decent horse archers, which they utilize a lot, and oftentimes in the game they gain a pretty large area, especially at the expense of Dacians and Germanians. Their starting cities are pretty poor, and also the early conquests of them are pretty poor, so they are hard pressed to get large armies and high tier units available for them. Then again, they are pretty well protected. They need to contest with Parthians, Dacians, Germanians, and Thracians, but since almost all of these factions have to wage war against some other factions as well, they cannot concentrate their full might against Scythians, and the Scythian horse archers will perform really well against Dacians and Germanians. Their unit roster isn't that good. Of course, there are those horse archer and cavalry units, but they are lacking in infantry and in the kind of missile units that fight on foot. So I think they are superior to Parthians as well as to Armenians and maybe even against Pontus. They are somewhere around here. Even though the Parthians have the cataphract units that will very well beat the Scythian heaviest cavalry, but since Parthia won't be able to recruit them that early on, then I think the Scythians will fare better. Then we have Seleucids. They have a really spread out starting position. It's kind of a line from modern Turkey to modern Iraq. So they have many enemies around them, some of which are very strong, for example the Egypt and Greek cities. Additionally, they need to fight against Pontus, Armenia, Parthia at least, and all of these will most likely be aggressive towards Seleucids. The starting cities are pretty decent, but the Seleucids have troubles concentrating their strength to fight the battles that matter the most. They will need to abandon at least some areas in order to defend themselves, not to be wiped out. And most often in the early game, Seleucids will get wiped out, if not played by a human player. Their army roster is pretty decent. They have multiple pike and spear units that can form phalanx. They have decent missile units and decent cavalry units as well. And their cavalry units contains also elephants. So the unit roster is clearly going for them. If they could secure their starting position, I think they will be pretty well matched against Egypt or even Roman factions. But since the starting position is such a difficult one, Seleucids will also get a B tier. But since I like war elephants, they will get a position better than the Pontus, at least. Maybe it will be in B tier and in this position. Then we have the Spain. One additional barbarian faction. Their starting position in the Western Europe, in the Spanish Peninsula, Iberian Peninsula, is pretty difficult to assault. Of course, Numidia can attack from south, but they will need ships. And one Gaulish province is in the middle of the Spanish provinces, and then there is a Carthaginian city as well. So, in order to gain more land, Spain needs to attack either Gaul or Carthage. Carthage has pretty good units, but it's spread thin, so Spain can muster enough forces to conquer the Carthaginian city in the Iberian Peninsula. And the unit roster of Spain is kind of decent. They have the Scutarii as well as Bull Warriors, which are pretty well rounded, at least in the early game. So they can hold their own against Gaulish units, and especially the Scutoria's ability to throw spears before engaging in melee will also serve them well. Of course, the Bull Warriors will require quite high tier unit producing facilities to work, so that will take at least some time before they are able to do that. The starting cities are pretty poor, and some other cities on the coast can be rather rich ones if they manage to conquer them, but the faction isn't really that good, even though the Bull Warriors have 2 hit points, one of the only infantry units that have that going for them. But as most of the barbarian factions, the Spain will be in B tier. I think they will fare better than the Britons, but Germania against Spain, I think Germania will eventually win, because they have the wider variety of melee troops. Then we have the Roman Senate, which will occupy Rome, and they will actually conquer nothing else. They are protected by the other 3 Roman factions surrounding them. They have at least 2 or 3 starting armies initially, so they are pretty well protected, but in the late game, when the Roman Civil War starts, they will get eaten up pretty quickly. So they won't compete against these 3 Roman factions, but their armies are pretty decent. They will last long in the campaign against other factions, and the troop roster for a Roman faction once again is very good. Rome is a very good city to have, so I will give them a B rank, mainly because they have only one city, namely Rome. If they would conquer other areas, they would go at least to A tier, if not S tier. Maybe A tier, because the other Roman factions will take the majority of the other cities most likely before the Senate could react. And as the last faction, we have Thracians, kind of a hybrid faction containing the elements of barbarians and Greek factions as well. And there we have pretty decent starting cities. They have quite high amounts of wealth, and unfortunately they have only 2 starting cities and no kind of rebel cities nearby, at least that they will take. So they will need to wage war pretty soon against rather strong factions, maybe against Macedon, against which they will lose. I think they will be able to hold their own against Dacians and against Scythians, but they are most often unable to advance against these 2 factions. So Thracia is kind of doomed to be a decent small faction among other factions that can grow a bit faster than them. So their starting position kind of isn't optimal for them. Their unit roster is decent one, containing some strong barbarian units and some hoplite phalanx units. The cavalry composition and missile unit composition isn't that good, but not very terrible either. But because of that starting position, I think Thracia will get a low C tier. They have potential for being a better faction, but the kind of starting locations keep them down a bit too much. And let's make a quick review if there is a need for some adjustments. I'm a bit tempted to put Greek cities or Macedon into A tier. But since the Greek cities are so spread out, I don't think they will survive long enough there. The Seleucids, they have pretty high position here. I think maybe the Roman Senate should go there. And maybe I should put Pontus before Seleucids here. And then here I'm not certain if Armenia deserves the B tier as Parthias in C tier, but maybe we will do with that. And then we have the barbarian factions, and let's see about their order here. I think that's pretty okay here. Yeah, and the Thracians, they are pretty good faction, or they are not bad faction, but the starting position puts them there. I think we have the faction tier list here. Thank you very much. You can post in a comment if you disagree with me, and you can ground your opinion as well. We may have a discussion. And this is only my personal opinion. You may disagree with that freely. And if you like the content, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. That will help a great deal. Have a great rest of the day. Quality Old Games out.